Hi everybody, my name is David Gully and I'm at Bentley University, and this is the second of 4 videos on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. So the first video looked at the Fed's old balance sheet. This video looks at the Fed's new balance sheet post-QE. The third video will look at the impact of QE on the economy, and then the fourth video will look at the eventual shrinking of the Fed's balance sheet. And please, for other videos, please see our YouTube channel. So as we talked about in the previous video, the Fed's old balance sheet used to be very simple prior to 2007. Mostly it was composed of Treasury bills and loans to banks and then a few other smaller assets. And then on the liability side, they had bank reserves and then currency and coins in circulation and then a few more other smaller liabilities. So life was very easy and simple back then. But then, starting in 2007, there were some very major changes that occurred. So what the Fed first did is it introduced a whole variety of liquidity programs that were designed to improve the functioning of the financial system directly and then indirectly to try to improve the overall health of the U.S. economy. And one example here would be the term auction facility. And it turns out all of these new tools were variations of the lender of last resort. And more relevantly for our purposes here, they also introduced quantitative easing programs, or in other words, large-scale asset purchases. That's sort of central bank speak for QE. And what QE involves is buying assets that are non-traditional central bank assets, and then creating an offsetting liability of bank reserves to pay for these assets. So again, the key thing here to think about is this, is that QE programs are nothing more than open market operations with non-traditional assets. And the traditional asset the Fed used to acquire were Treasury bills. Okay? And so let's suppose, for example, that the Fed buys a long-term Treasury security, say either a note or a bond. So on the asset side, the bond or note would show up there, and then in order to pay for this, reserves in the banking system would increase by $2,000. And notice this is just like old-style open market operations, at least in terms of the impact on the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet. Then likewise, suppose the Fed bought a $3,000 mortgage-backed security. Well, this would also show up on the Fed's balance sheet as an asset. To pay for that mortgage-backed security, just like they paid for the Treasury, they would also have to increase bank reserves. So the key thing to remember here is this: the impact on reserves on the Fed's balance sheet is exactly the same as with traditional open market operations. But notice the composition of the Fed's balance sheet, the duration, is also dramatically changed. The Fed is now holding long-term securities, it's holding mortgage-backed securities, and these have a much longer duration than the standard Treasury bills, of course. So a quick summary of the various QE programs. QE1 was introduced in November 2008 and ran through June in 2010, and that involved about $2 trillion of longer-term treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. QE2 ran from November 2010 to June 2011. That involved $600 billion of long-term treasuries. QE3 started in 2012, September, and that ran through October 2014. And that was a $1.7 trillion collective buy of longer-term treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. And let's also not forget the maturity extension program, and that was also known as Operation Twist 2. That ran from December 2011 to December 2012, and that was for a total value of $660 billion. What's interesting to note here is this did not change the size of the balance sheet. It did change the competition. What the maturity extension program involved was the trade of short-term securities for long-term securities. So the Fed reduced the volume of short-term bills they held, and they increased the volume of longer-term treasuries they held. So it changed the composition, but not the total size. And so here's a good visual. This is from the Cleveland Fed. You can see that prior to 2007 here, the Fed's balance sheet was made mostly up of Treasury bills, short-term Treasury securities, and a very small volume of loans to banks. But as you can see, that starting in 2008, there was a very dramatic change in terms of what happened to the Fed's balance sheet. And you can see the impact of the various QE programs on the Fed's balance sheet in terms of the size and the composition. And so you can see here now that the Fed holds a large volume of longer-term Treasury securities, a large volume of mortgage-backed securities, and still a reasonable volume of short-term Treasury bills. And here's another visual. This is from the Wall Street Journal. And you can see on the asset side, it looks very similar to the previous graph. But what this also does is very helpfully, this introduces QE1, QE2, Operation Twist, the Maturity Extension Program, and QE3. And you can see the impact of those on the size and also the composition of the Fed's balance sheet as well. And so a quick summary here. The size of the balance sheet roughly quintupled from a little over $800 billion to about $4.5 trillion. The average maturity increased a great deal, in other words, the average duration. And there are also now non-treasury securities on the books as well. This is referred to as mortgage-backed securities in this situation. And so a question we want to answer in the next video is, well, why did they engage in QE in the first place? Thank you all very much.